Resident Evil 3 strikes an interesting position in the Resident Evil series. This position makes it sort of a mixed bag. After two entries that had their feet firmly planted in the survival horror side of things, Resident Evil 3 adds quite a lot of action into the mix. While Resident Evil 3 is still obviously a survival horror game, it ups the intensity, pace, and general atmosphere of the Resident Evil series. And my overall feelings on the game are kind of complicated. It definitely isn't a bad game by any means, and some of the new additions are fantastic. The pressure and intensity of the newly introduced Nemesis enemy truly makes you feel like you're being chased. It's everything that Mr. X from Resident Evil 2 had, and just a bit more, because the pressure is so relentless. The new systems like gunpowder mixing and the new zombie types make things feel fresh. It sets Resident Evil 3 apart on its own, making it feel like its own entry in the series rather than just another upgrade. And the scope of Resident Evil 3's environment is probably one of its greatest strengths. The game has expanded to include the entire city. While this was just an implication in Resident Evil 2, in Resident Evil 3 it is a literal projection onto the realm of the world. The world feels bigger, bringing with it the background and history of the city itself, the suggested lives wasted, and the implicit routines destroyed. The backdrop of this game is no longer just a station that once used to house jobs, but a city that was teeming with life, now desolate and void of life outside of zombies and genetically modified monsters. But not everything in Resident Evil 3 works. The structure and pressure often feel like too much for the series. Those moments of great atmosphere and tension that were all too common in previous entries just don't appear as often in Resident Evil 3. The game overshadows that atmosphere with the rampant pressure and stress of the Raccoon City streets and the chasing presence of Nemesis. Personally, I don't think that this tone lends itself well to the Resident Evil format. I don't think that action is misplaced in the series. It would become known for action at a certain point in time, but in this moment, in this style, it wasn't exactly my thing. That being said, Resident Evil 3 isn't bad, it's just different. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll be talking about Resident Evil 3, taking a look at gameplay, mechanics, story, and everything in between. If you haven't seen the previous videos in this series, I would highly recommend checking them out. Each of these videos is meant to represent a different era of the Resident Evil series, so sometimes I'll be talking about additional spin-off games that were released around the time that the central game was. While the story of Resident Evil isn't always the most important part, watching the other videos will give you context and perspective on the history of the series. If you enjoy this video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel as it really helps me out. You can also support the channel by subscribing to the Patreon. I'm currently watching and reviewing the Resident Evil movies exclusively over there, so check that out if it seems interesting to you. Spoilers for Resident Evil 3. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Resident Evil 3. The development of Resident Evil 3 is kind of complicated because it's tied up in the development of multiple other Resident Evil projects. After the release of Resident Evil 2, production began on Resident Evil 3 and multiple Resident Evil spin-off games. Resident Evil 3 was originally intended to be directed by Hideki Kamiya, the same director from Resident Evil 2. But as production moved along, the PlayStation 2 was announced, and this complicated things a bit. The original project with Kamiya at the head was meant to be centered around Hunk, the mercenary from the fourth survivor scenario in Resident Evil 2. The game was set on a cruise ship and saw Hunk trying to get a sample of the G-Virus to Umbrella. This project was shelved because it couldn't be completed before the PlayStation 2 was set to be launched. Because of this, Capcom decided to use one of its spin-off projects that was already pretty far along in development. This project was internally referred to as Resident Evil 1.5, not to be confused with the cancelled version of Resident Evil 2 that most call Resident Evil 1.5. This project was being led by a less experienced team because it wasn't originally intended to be a mainline entry in the series. But since the original Resident Evil 3 couldn't be finished in time, they had to make do. This project was directed by Kazuhiro Aoyama and was written by Yakuhisa Kawamura. Kawamura had originally worked as an apprentice for a manga artist named Yukito Kishiro. He wrote the novelization of Ganmu, but when it wasn't successful, he pursued a career in games. He was hired at Capcom and given the task of reworking the Dino Crisis script. After this, he was tasked with working on this Resident Evil spin-off game. Kawamura was very involved in the project, creating the scenario, boss stages, and was the one that originally conceived of the live segment mechanics. Kawamura will come back into the Resident Evil story when we talk about Resident Evil 4, but this spin-off game that he and Aoyama were working on had to become Resident Evil 3. Since it was originally conceived as a story where the main character would escape from Raccoon City during the events of Resident Evil 2, it didn't take much to make it a mainline entry. The team decided to switch out the main character for Jill Valentine and work the project into the overall story. Shinji Mikami was once again producer on the story, but decided to take a backseat early on and let the directors do their job. This shuffling around would eventually lead to a lot more hiccups and bumps when it came to Resident Evil 4, but before that, we need to talk about the third entry in the series. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was released for the Sony PlayStation 1 in Japan on September 22, 1999, in North America on November 11, 1999, and in the EU on February 21, 2000. Before we talk about Resident Evil 3, I need to talk about the different versions of the game and which version I played for this video. Resident Evil 3 was probably the first entry in the series to not have 100 different ports. This was mostly due to the fact that this game wasn't nearly as successful as the first two. Most of this information on the ports I did obtain from these write-ups that the website Strategy Wiki has on each of them. The original version of the game was released on PlayStation. The second release was on Windows. This version of the game included higher resolution graphics and the ability to select alternative outfits from the start of the game. It also included 2 extra outfits. The Dreamcast version of the game was released in late 2000 and has the same features as the Windows version of the game. And finally, the GameCube port was released in 2003. This version had improved graphics and a higher frame rate for the cutscenes, though it doesn't have the extra outfits included in the PC and Dreamcast versions of the game. I originally was going to play the GameCube version of the game with the Seamless HD mod, just like I did for Resident Evil 2, but for some reason I had issues with this mod and found that it wasn't working properly. It was most likely something that I was doing, so I just ended up playing the GOG version of the game for Windows. This version of the game is upscaled a bit if you prefer that kind of thing, but also lends itself to replayability by offering you the ability to skip loading screens. Most of the footage you'll see in this video is from the GOG version of the game. Resident Evil 3 begins with a narration from Jill Valentine. She sets the narrative tone for our story. Jill is in Raccoon City, and before this story ends, Umbrella as a corporation and a presence here will fall. We saw in Resident Evil 2 that Chris and Jill were planning to head to the Umbrella headquarters to trace the company down at the source. Resident Evil 3 deals with Jill actually escaping the city, but in that escape, she'll get intertwined in much more trouble than she ever asked for. We then see groups of zombies swarming Raccoon City. The police respond in kind to this attack, cars and cops and helicopters and an arsenal of weaponry. They try to blast the hordes of undead but are quickly overrun. Umbrella soldiers all over the city face the same as they use every weapon at their disposal to try and push back the enemy, but lose in the end. I have to say that the FMVs in Resident Evil 3 are probably among my favorite in the PS1 era. They, just like the rest of the game, increase the scope of the situation greatly. Instead of groups of zombies, we have an entire army of them. Instead of invading a building, they are all over the city. Jill starts the game by saying farewell to her life and her home, and the game cuts in quickly, setting itself apart from the get-go by showing off its increased action and pace. Jill is launched from an exploding building into a nearby alleyway. She tries to escape the confines of narrow brick and walls, but only ends up surrounded by the undead. She ends up escaping into a nearby warehouse and finding a man named Dario Rosso, a salesman who doesn't exactly have the fighting spirit for this whole outbreak thing. He immediately rushes into a nearby container where he'll stay. He doesn't want to go back outside and would rather stick to the safety of this steel box. It's an understandable position to take, one that Resident Evil 3 will explore and return to once again. The choice that many characters have been faced with throughout zombie media. Do they try to escape or accept the safety of their fate? This is where our story starts. Jill Valentine is stuck in a warehouse mere months after her incident at the Arklay Mountains mansion, and after her realization that the RPD and the higher-ups were not going to do anything about Umbrella or their viruses. Her worst-case scenario is playing out right in front of her. Before we move on with the story, I'd like to briefly talk about the gameplay of Resident Evil 3 and how it compares to the first two games in the series. Resident Evil 3 works on a similar framework to the first two games. It is primarily a survival horror game presented to us through fixed camera angles. We aim down sights, rotating our aim to point our weapons at enemies, and changing the level we're aiming at to shoot enemies on the ground or above us. But Resident Evil 3 introduces quite a few changes when it comes to movement. The first of those changes are the dodge. If we aim down our sights and press the shoot button at the same time as an enemy is attacking us, we won't shoot, but instead we'll dodge the enemy's attack. This was an addition that I enjoyed in theory, but didn't really enjoy in the implementation. This is probably not the fault of the team working on the game, but that at this point in the series, the team's ambition was outgrowing the systems they were working with. The dodge doesn't really feel that great because we can accidentally activate it when we're trying to shoot at an enemy, but the player shouldn't care, right? Because they avoided damage in the end. But it kind of takes some of the agency away from the player. It kind of feels like an auto dodge in some ways, even though we are actively activating it. On the other side of that coin, the dodge adds a ton of movement to the action of the game. This is a trend that we'll see continued throughout Resident Evil 3, that the game puts an emphasis on fast-paced action. The other new movement tool that we've gained is that of the quick turn. This is an incredibly useful tool in our disposal. In previous games, if we wanted to turn around, we would need to slowly rotate our character 180 degrees before moving forward. But the quick turn allows us to do this instantly. It's a great feature, one that I have no complaints about, especially because this entry almost requires its use because of its design. Resident Evil 3 also sports the same framework when it comes to inventory management. We still have safe boxes where we can store extra items. We still have limited inventory space to store ammo, key items, and healing items. But the big difference in items comes from the new gunpowder system. In Resident Evil 3, we can collect 3 different types of gunpowder throughout the game: gunpowder type A, B, and C. We can combine these items to create different gunpowder types and use them with the reloading tool to create ammunition from that gunpowder. There's actually a decent amount of combinations in the game. Gunpowder A will give us handgun bullets, gunpowder B will give us shotgun shells, and gunpowder C will give us grenade rounds. Combining any type of gunpowder with C gunpowder will give us a variety of different grenade launcher rounds, and combining 3 gunpowder Cs will create magnum rounds. We also have a skill associated with creating ammunition. The more we create a specific type of ammunition, the more our skill will go up, and moving forward, we'll get more ammo from that gunpowder type. I really like this system because I think it provides more dynamic options for gameplay. If ammo placement around the world is fixed, then the amount of ammunition that we get for each weapon is fixed. Introducing the gunpowder system lets us choose the type of ammo that we'd like to create. If we want to use our C gunpowder to create grenade rounds, or save it all to create magnum ammo, that's up to us. It gives a bit more agency to the player and creates a difference in playthroughs. Also, focusing on one ammunition type means that you can get more from that ammo. Increasing your skill allows you to effectively get more bang for your buck when it comes to that gunpowder. This system would return in some future Resident Evil games, even being reintroduced in the Resident Evil 2 remake. Other than these additions, the formula of Resident Evil 3 is basically the same as the first two games. There are slight changes to enemies, gameplay, and larger changes in that of bosses and environments, but we'll talk about those when we get there. Jill eventually makes it out of the warehouse and heads into the streets of Raccoon City. This is the first time that we're introduced to the expanded scope of Resident Evil 3. Resident Evil 3 expands its world, something that I praised Resident Evil 2 for doing. In the first Resident Evil, the setting was simply a mansion, a large building constructed in the image of a confusing labyrinth, meant to disorient, meant to trap, to keep away. But it became the stronghold of the STARS members. Eventually, they found the secret underground lab, but the setting wasn't enormous. In Resident Evil 2, we were forced to take shelter inside the police station, an archetypal representation of control, of safety, arsenals, and force. But at the beginning of the game, we're thrust briefly into the streets of Raccoon City. And when the windows open up and the zombies start crawling inside, the scope is expanded. But this is where Resident Evil 3 starts, and where most of the game takes place, in the city streets. The environment is Raccoon City itself, and instead of just a singular location with some other buildings branching off of it, it's the entire city. This sets an interesting precedent, though, that we no longer have the safety of a stronghold. The protection of walls and a roof is completely gone. You could view those same walls and roof as a trap, but they at least represented a lesser evil. There was a filter on those walls, one that only allowed a slow trickle of the infected from the outside. In Resident Evil 3, that filter is entirely removed, and we are exposed to the source itself. No longer trapped in a cage or protected by a building, we are out in the elements. It's the danger of the open wilderness or the threat of the uninterrupted desert. That doesn't mean that we won't have access to different buildings in Resident Evil 3. We will travel to many throughout the course of the story, but we won't be locked inside of one for the entirety of the playtime. Raccoon City is the framing device for this entry, and it becomes a character in its own right, one whose fate is brought into question as soon as the opening credits begin to roll. Raccoon City, or at least the areas that we can traverse, are split up into two sections, uptown and downtown. Most parts of these areas are accessible by weaving through buildings, avoiding burning heaps of metal and broken down structures. It adds to the feeling of wandering through a broken city, and walking through these alleys and narrow passageways leaves one's eyes to wander to the backgrounds. The PS1 Resident Evil games have always excelled at their pre-rendered backgrounds, but Resident Evil 3's backgrounds feel like they tell a story. Little shops with broken windows, bikes left to rust away, cars abandoned. The places and items tell the tale of a city lost to the Scourge, captured by the armies of the undead. The battle is not being waged, it's already lost when we begin the game. As Jill navigates the zombie-filled streets of Raccoon City, she hears someone battling the undead in a nearby bar. As we enter, we see Brad being attacked. Resident Evil 3 takes place the day before the events of Resident Evil 2, so Brad Vickers, the STARS helicopter pilot, has not quite been consumed by the T-virus just yet. He's already heavily wounded and has accepted his fate. According to Brad, someone is hunting down STARS members, and he seems to think that there's no escaping it.
Listen, he's coming for us. We're both gonna die.
What are you saying?
You'll see. He's after STARS members. There's no escape.
Brad heads out the front door before we can ask him any questions. Nearby, we can find a postcard of the St. Michael Clock Tower, a monument that will become a lot more important later in the story. Heading through the streets, we can gain access to some new areas by burning cords around locked doors and entering new alleyways. Jill quickly happens upon the RPD though, and outside its entrance, Brad is facing an enemy that's far stronger than he can deal with.
We've gotta... Jill, help!
This is the introduction of Nemesis, our new primary villain for this entry. We're also introduced to a new mechanic here. After Brad is brutally killed by this boss, we're given a choice, either to fight with the monster or to head into the police station. This is the first of what Resident Evil calls live selections. We have only a few seconds to decide which choice we want to make. These live selection moments are presented throughout the entire story and will affect the version of the game that we play in various ways. For example, this first choice will allow us to either have a boss fight with Nemesis or to avoid that fight entirely. If we manage to kill Nemesis, then he will drop parts that we can use to assemble a better pistol. We can also get a key card off of Brad's body that will allow us to access a computer inside of the RPD that will give us a safe code for an easier path to a key item. Most of the choices in the game don't drastically affect the story of the game, they just sort of affect how the game plays out. There are certain choices that have larger, more drastic effects, but we'll talk about those later as we get to them. The live selection system overall is a good choice, and once again makes the system more dynamic. While our choices aren't necessarily going to determine if the main character lives or dies, but it will affect the path that we take through Resident Evil 3. This whole section introduces Nemesis as well. Nemesis is our equivalent to Mr. X in this entry. Nemesis will follow us throughout the entire game, even if we manage to defeat him outside of the RPD. He will chase Jill relentlessly through buildings, on the city streets, everywhere. Sometimes he will corner us and we'll be faced with more choices, whether to fight him or not. Nemesis sets himself apart from Mr. X though, because of his general demeanor and pace. In Resident Evil 2, Mr. X was an overwhelming presence because at the beginning, he felt almost unpredictable. He would follow us throughout the game and was persistent but slow. He was a constant presence that slowly but surely would make his way towards you. It was the consistent thrum of perseverance and knowing that regardless, over time, he would make his way to us. Nemesis is effectively the same presence, but just turned up to 11. Nemesis is much faster, much stronger, and much more persistent. While there were moments of downtime with Mr. X, Nemesis never even gives us room to breathe. He will follow us across rooms and through doorways. He will dash across the entire area just to get to Jill. He is difficult to avoid, but our best option is honestly just to run from him. And Nemesis is honestly the scariest part of the game. It takes the pressure and intensity from Resident Evil 2's Mr. X and fully activates it. Nemesis is designed this way to adjust itself to the larger scope of Resident Evil 3. If Nemesis moved just as fast as Mr. X, then he wouldn't be as imposing of a presence in the wider, more open streets of Raccoon City. But this brings me to another point about Resident Evil 3. The game includes two difficulty options from the very start, easy mode and hard mode. Hard mode is actually just the normal mode of the game, but honestly the difference between these two modes isn't just how difficult the game is, but in my opinion, hard mode actually sort of ruins the vibe of this game. Because there's such a lack of emphasis on the atmosphere of this game, the difficulty doesn't feel like it lends itself any more to the ambiance of the game. Playing on easy mode does provide you with a variety of different weapons from the start of the game. This gives the game, which has a higher pace, bigger action sequences, and a larger scope, a more action-oriented feel. And this doesn't mean that I don't like the harsher survival horror elements in a more action-oriented game. I just felt like I had more fun on my easy mode playthrough than the one I did on hard mode. Regardless, entering the police station sees us retreading some of the ground that we did in Resident Evil 2, though technically we're getting here well before Leon and Claire did. We can venture into the offices nearby and find Marvin Branagh after he's already been bitten. We can find a memo on his body that notes how Branagh was looking into a damaged jewel clock at one of the nearby gates. This is one of our first objectives, to get the missing jewels for this strange gate mechanism. One of them happens to be inside of the RPD. We can also visit the STARS office, and as Jill leaves, she hears a breaking up radio communication from someone named Carlos. He's outputting an SOS as his platoon has been cut off and they're being taken over by zombies. On the way back through the building, we are assaulted and chased by Nemesis once again. Even if we killed him before, he has risen again with seemingly no issue. We'll eventually end up at a restaurant where we can find some background information on Raccoon City and how integral Umbrella was to the whole place. Shortly after this, we can gain access to a hatch in the kitchen. As soon as we do this, though, an Umbrella mercenary named Carlos shows up. Jill is, of course, upset that Carlos works for Umbrella, the company she considers the enemy at this point. Carlos was sent here as a part of a group that was meant to save the civilians of Raccoon City, but things went south pretty quickly. As Jill is having this conversation, Nemesis appears again and we have another live selection moment. We can either run into the basement or hide inside the kitchen. Hiding inside the kitchen seems like the better option because this label is probably the worst in the entire game. Hide inside the kitchen actually means run outside of the kitchen and blow the entire thing up. This defeats Nemesis, and if playing on hard mode, Nemesis will drop another piece of weaponry here. We can exit out the back door where Jill asks Carlos why his team was sent here in the first place. Carlos claims that they were sent only to rescue civilians, but Jill uses this moment to argue the morality of Umbrella being involved in the cleanup of their own mess.
Why did Umbrella send your team here?
Our mission is to rescue the civilians.
How kind of you. Considering Umbrella caused all this in the first place, those liars!
But Carlos ensures that he separates him and his company from Umbrella. They're only mercenaries, and he requests that Jill join them before rushing off to investigate other noises throughout the city. After this, we can continue our search for the missing gems. We end up in a burning building that almost explodes as we're passing through it. Upstairs, we can find the second of 2 gems we need. We can also find an interesting memo from a reporter that was looking into the cannibal disease that was spreading throughout the city. They knew that the city held the key to the disease's cure and creation, but they were still tracing down leads. The funniest thing about this note, though, is just how often it uses the word disease. I have heard rumors that many people are also suffering from this disease now. However, the causes of the disease is not yet known. Is this another mystery of the present disease? As we exit the building with both gems in hand, Nemesis attacks once again, and it's quite a tense chase to get back down to the entrance of this building. But by placing the gems inside of the gate contraption, we can gain access to a new area. Here we can travel through the Lonsdale Yard and eventually reach a train. Inside, Jill will meet another survivor from Carlos's team, a man named Nikolai. He walks away once he learns that Jill is a member of STARS. There's a wounded soldier laying on the bench of the train. He's not entirely with it and seems to be fading in and out. He thinks he's still being attacked, and Jill tells him it'll be alright before talking to Carlos in the next car. Nikolai thinks they can't trust Jill because she's a part of STARS. Carlos correctly recognizes the situation, that group loyalties will get them nowhere in an outbreak this dire.
No, we can't trust her.
But Sergeant, we need her help. Our unit's down to you, me, and Lieutenant Mikhail. That's it. And Mikhail's hurt bad. If we don't cooperate, we won't be walking away from this mission.
Nikolai eventually relents and tells Jill their current plan. They're trying to make it to the St. Michael Clock Tower to meet up with a chopper that will act as their evac out of the city. Because the city has already been destroyed and roads have been blocked, they need to use the train car to get to the clock tower. Carlos then gives Jill an extra pack that increases our inventory space. At this point, our overall goal is to get the train running again. For this, we need 3 parts: a power cable, some machine oil, and a fuse. We can get the machine oil by heading to a nearby gas station where we meet Carlos again. Zombies end up tracking the 2 down, and Carlos has to head outside to defend the building. After we solve a puzzle and get the machine oil though, the place blows up, enveloping the gas station in hellfire as the 2 barely make it out alive. This leaves Carlos to head out again, looking for more materials. We'll eventually have to take and place some items in the statue of the mayor of Raccoon City, Michael Warren. This will give us a battery that we can use to get an elevator down into a construction area of the city, which allows us into the substation. Here we can get the fuse, but we're quickly set upon by a massive group of zombies. If we decide to run away, Nemesis will actually show up and take some of the zombies out for us, but we will then be forced to deal with him. If we increase the electricity output, we'll explode zombie heads like it's nothing, giving us a clear path back out of this place. Something I should also note that makes its first appearance in Resident Evil 3 are interactable objects in the environment. And by interactable, I actually mean shootable objects. These can be red barrels that explode when hit with a bullet, a transformer box on the wall, or a loose valve on a pipe. This is another tool that the game gives us to deal with the increased amount of zombies in this entry, because there are so many more enemies than there were last time. We need some way to thin those numbers. Interacting with these objects just feels great, especially on the harder modes. A huge group of zombies is a terrifying sight because we know we're going to have to spend tons of ammo to clear them out, or expend health objects to run away from them. But exploding an entire group with the use of a wall transformer leaves us relieved that we can use 1 or 2 bullets to deal with multiple enemies. Remember, Resident Evil is a game about efficiency. Now that we have the machine oil and the fuse, we still need the power cable and an additive for the fuel. The power cable can be found in a car in a nearby garage. The additive can be found in a sales office. We find Nikolai crouching over the body of a dead soldier from his party. He admits to shooting Murphy because he was bitten. He takes a cold approach to the soldier's death. He would have died anyway and even turned beforehand, so what's the problem? But Jill takes umbrage with this. He was still conscious. He was still alive. There was still a chance. Nikolai rationalizes the action by saying that it took fewer bullets to kill him now than it would have if he was a zombie. Honestly, he's kind of got a point there. Seems like Nikolai knows how to conserve his ammo. He must have played the first 2 games. Nikolai is typing things into his computer, and we have to gain access to the back room here. We need the password for a computer, which a nearby note tells us is a word that everyone will know, a common word. We can use a remote to watch a commercial on the TV for an everyday medicine. Interestingly enough, the solution to this puzzle is randomized. There are only a few solutions that the game can cycle through, but it could be different between your playthrough and mine. There's a lot of puzzles like this in the game, and I think it was the first game in the series to have dynamic puzzle solutions. I love this change, and I think that not only does it make the game more dynamic, it requires you to actually interact with the puzzle instead of just looking up the solution. Getting the additive from the back room gives us all the items we need to fix the train, but as we grab it, zombies start pouring into the building. And I just have to say that I love this cutscene. It's pretty short, as most of the FMVs in this game are, but it's so well done, especially for the time period. The undead pouring into the windows, the way that the blinds bend and break, it just looks so cool and lends itself to the atmosphere of Resident Evil really well. We have to deal with this group of zombies, and we can find the place where Nikolai was, but we see that both Nikolai and Murphy are gone. Nikolai's computer has been broken as well, so we can't access it. Heading back, we'll be chased once again by Nemesis, and at this point, he's gained a rocket launcher as well, meaning that if we're running away from him down any straight paths, then we need to zig and zag to make sure we can avoid him. On our way back through the garage, Jill gets caught in an earthquake, and we have another split decision. This is probably one of the least impactful decisions, as we really will just gain access to a small underground area if we jump down. Generally, I avoid the boxes and continue forward, as it's the faster route to our destination. On our way back to the train, we experience another earthquake, and this one captures Jill no matter what. She ends up underground, and we're quickly attacked by a large worm. We'll have to quickly get out of here because this thing will eat our health pretty fast. We can activate the ladder controls and escape the place to finally get to the train and get out of this crumbling city. Once we fix the train, we tell Carlos about Nikolai's fate. Carlos decides to operate the car, and we immediately hear a disturbance come from the other room. Nemesis is in the other cabin, and the wounded Mikhail uses the last of his strength to fend off the beast so that Jill can get away.
Jill, get out of the cable car now!
Mikhail, wait, don't!
Get out of here! Hurry!
We have another decision here, to use the emergency brake or to jump out the window. This choice will determine where we enter the clock tower, either through the front or the back. It will also make the boss fight with Nemesis later easier or harder. I decided to jump out the window in the playthrough you're seeing here, allowing me to enter the clock tower through the back door. The train crashes and Jill awakes in the burning wreckage, barely making it out before she's swarmed by more undead. Now that we're in the clock tower, we do actually have a sort of makeshift stronghold for a very brief period of time. We meet Carlos pretty quickly, who seems to have made it out of the horrific train crash unscathed. Carlos basically says that there's no time to rest, we need to keep moving, and then walks away. In the main room of the clock tower, we can find a dead member of the Umbrella team who had written orders on his body. The team was sent in to wipe out the infected and get any surviving civilians to the clock tower. Priority was given to Umbrella-affiliated individuals or employees, though. Heading through the building, we can find a few keys that will give us access to the other areas of the clock tower. There's an interesting moment, though, in a safe room. As we're heading from one end of the room to the other, the ceiling of the room shakes. The dust on the ceiling falls, and we hear a loud noise from above. When I first played this section, I was sure that an enemy was going to fall through the ceiling and attack. This brief moment isn't long or drawn out, but it does something incredibly important. Just like Resident Evil 2 made the puzzle rooms no longer safe, with this small scare, Resident Evil 3 makes you question the integrity of the safe room as a concept. In general, safe rooms have always been no combat zones in the Resident Evil series. Enemies cannot enter them, and while in them, you are treated to calming, if not slightly haunting, music. You can switch out your weapons and save without a care in the world, but the implication that an enemy might come crashing through the ceiling makes us question whether the developers are about to break that agreement. If they've decided that the standing truce between the player and developer is no longer upheld, and they shatter it in a blaze of vicious betrayal. They don't, of course. Nothing is allowed to come through the ceiling, and the safe room is intact, but this is a subtle way to make the player feel much less comfortable in the safe room from now on. It's a lingering feeling that lasts the rest of the runtime of Resident Evil 3. Making our way through the clock tower, we have to obtain 2 gears to get the bell functioning again. We'll solve various puzzles to make this happen, and be attacked by Nemesis on the roof. Giant spiders also reappear in this section, and you know what? I didn't really care that much this time. Take that, spiders. Once we obtain both gears, the bell is rung and the team's chopper arrives to pick the group up. We've achieved our happy, idyllic ending once again after a long journey. Just kidding, haha, get pwned, noob. Nemesis shoots down the chopper and we have our first official boss battle of the game. We have to battle Nemesis in the courtyard. It's a pretty tough fight, especially if one of our choices earlier means that Nemesis has his rocket launcher. He will use this ranged weapon and his dashing close-up attack to deliver heavy damage. Luckily, our dodge ability means that we have far less of a problem fighting in these close corridors. When we finally take him out, Carlos comes to Jill's aid. Before the battle even started, Nemesis attacked Jill with one of his strange-looking tentacles. This actually infects Jill with the virus, which we can see during the battle by checking our health status. It will show us the status of infected instead of fine, caution, or danger. After the battle, Jill passes out and Carlos takes her back into the clock tower. He tells Jill that she'll be safe here, but they need to find an antivirus to cure her. There's an absolutely insane line here where Jill says,
I'm okay. Don't feel any pain. But that's what bothers me. If I can't feel anything, then what does that mean?
And I get it. This is supposed to just indicate the fact that Jill is losing control of herself due to the virus overtaking her system. But it's this weird, out-of-place, existential line that sets a precedent for how we think about the undead moving forward. Pain equals being alive. Pain equals life. Pain is good. In this world, pain is the only thing that means you haven't been overtaken, that you haven't succumbed to the forces of the undead just yet. That's the world we're in now, a world where losing pain means that you're gone. But Jill isn't quite done just yet. For this short section, we'll actually play as Carlos and try to find a cure for Jill before she turns. As Carlos, we have to head outside of the clock tower and back into the streets. We find a nearby hospital that is host to a new enemy type, a variant of the Hunter from Resident Evil 1. These are a disfigured version of the monsters that we saw before, referred to as the Hunter Beta, a test mutation in its earlier stages. They're spread all throughout the hospital in different forms. Downstairs, we can find Nikolai killing another one of the Umbrella mercenaries. He tells Carlos to not ask any questions, but Tyrell isn't quite dead yet and pulls the pin on his grenade. Nikolai manages to escape out the window, and Carlos heads back into the hospital proper. In a locked safe, we can find a vaccine base, and downstairs we can find another base to mix this with. We have to prepare the serum for the antivirus first, though, which takes solving a puzzle. Once we have it, another Hunter test mutation breaks out of the holding tubes. These are the Hunter Gammas, and they have a fish-like appearance, as well as a greater strength when compared to the Beta. On our way outside, Carlos finds a bomb placed on one of the struts in the lobby. As he leaves the building, it explodes, sending him hurling into the streets. We're chased by Nemesis once again, who seems to have survived his encounter with Jill and mutated into a stronger, faster form. Finding Jill, we can give her the vaccine we created in the hospital. He tells her that Nemesis is back and seems to think that it's specifically seeking her out. Oh geez, you think so, Carlos? Maybe it was the fact that every time he's present, he constantly mutters stars under his breath.
Stars, 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 stars.
Carlos tells Jill that Nikolai is still alive out there somewhere and that he is their enemy. We regain control of Jill at this point and head back out into the clock tower, where we're immediately met with resistance from Nemesis. We can head across the street and get access into the park, where we find a dead Umbrella merc in the mud. Turns out he was a supervisor, and his goal was to observe and record combat data on the Umbrella soldiers themselves. Afterwards, he was ordered to destroy the medical facility. He was also supposed to monitor the guinea pig's ability to accomplish its mission. This guinea pig could be Tyrant or Nemesis or any other manner of being. Heading through the park, we can enter an underground area and get access to the graveyard. Here we find a hidden Umbrella room behind a fireplace. It's clear that Umbrella was using people as testing guinea pigs. They were even planning on using the virus on prisoners of war to turn them into soldiers against their own comrades. We also find a memo in this room from Umbrella HQ ordering the Raccoon City project abandoned. They were trying to use their political connections to get things covered up, but it didn't work out. The US Army is planning on activating some sort of plan in the morning to obliterate the city. On the way out, a signal is put out to the nearby console telling all supervisors from Umbrella to evacuate. Nikolai shows up once again and tells Jill that the teams were sent out here for data collection. They didn't know the Umbrella soldiers would be killed, but they wanted to see them in action. As another earthquake starts, Nikolai heads out for his own safety. Outside, Jill is dragged underground to fight our second official boss fight of the game, the Gravedigger. The Gravedigger is a giant mutated worm that digs through the ground and attacks with its giant circular mouth. We basically just blast it full of bullets and get out of the way. When it dies, a grate nearby falls down and we can escape. Back out in the park, Jill encounters Nemesis on a hanging bridge. We have two options here, to jump or to push Nemesis off of the bridge. This is actually a pretty big choice and will affect the ending of the game. I'll talk about its implications once we get to the finale, but for now, this choice really just affects whether we enter the next area through the top floor or the sewers. Personally, I prefer jumping off the bridge myself, but only because other people told me to. With this, Jill is attacked by a group of zombies and Carlos comes in to save the day.
Rescuing you is becoming a full-time job.
Thanks, Carlos.
Carlos has found out that at dawn, the US government will be launching a missile at Raccoon City to wipe it out. We can investigate this facility, which turns out to be an Umbrella plant disguised as a deserted factory. The soldiers inside were permitted to shoot any civilians that arrived on site, and if they surrendered, they would become guinea pigs for the lab itself. The plant also contained an advanced containment system, which locked the entire facility down when contamination was detected. Our main goal in the facility is to make it through the lockdown. The first puzzle we have to solve is a water contamination puzzle. I'll be honest, I had to look up the solution for this one. I spent probably 10 different minutes trying combinations here. The goal is to match the result frequency with the sample frequency at the top represented by these green bars. We make these green bars by basically adding up the A, B, and C frequencies together. So if the sample bar in column 1 is 3 stacks high, then a bar needs to be present in A, B, and C for column 1. And if there's 2, then it should only be present in 2 of those, so on and so forth. But because there's 3 variables here and tons of different combinations, it just felt like guessing randomly at a certain point. Once we complete this puzzle, we are halfway to unlocking the door that we need to enter. Heading through the facility, we will encounter many test subjects in the area, stronger versions of the zombies we met out on the street. I should also note that zombies can actually be much faster in this entry. Certain zombies will rush to you much quicker, making them a bit more dangerous of a foe than before. It can be kind of annoying just because you expect to be able to kill them before they reach you if you're a certain distance away. But I suppose that feeds back into the dynamic system and unpredictability. We can find Nikolai in the factory at a certain point, but he heads behind a locked shutter, getting away before we can reach him. We can find the diary of a manager of the facility in one of these safe rooms. The manager was quite happy to start working here, but slowly fell into despair after he realized what was happening at the place. They didn't have enough space for all the bodies they had to dispose of in the testing process and quickly ran through the antibodies for the virus. The mutation quickly outgrew the vaccine that they had created, making it obsolete and killing their hopes of keeping the virus under control. Gathering enough keys and solving a few puzzles gives us access into the locked door of the facility, the treatment room. Here we'll face the second form of Nemesis, and a timer will count down at the top of the screen. If this timer reaches 0, the floor opens up and we're sent into a pool with the rest of the grotesque bodies and mutations in here. This fight actually isn't too hard because the valves on the sides of the room will let out a mixture that stuns Nemesis. This makes it easy to get tons of damage off on the boss before he gets back up. Once Nemesis is finally defeated, we can leave the room and watch as it falls into the contaminated water. We can then head out of the facility, finally able to make our getaway. But as we head to the control room, we find that Nikolai has already taken the chopper nearby. We can either negotiate with him and see him abandon us in the facility, or we can have a separate boss battle where we fire shots at him and his chopper. Either way, we have no chopper to leave this place, and a missile strike is incoming, noted not by a countdown timer, but a distance meter at the top of our screen. Carlos maintains that it isn't over, and he's going to find a way to get them out of the city. As we head down into the final sections of the laboratory, we have one final boss battle of this game. Nemesis returns once again in his final form, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and pulsing sacks of God knows what. In this room sits a massive railgun. This gun requires 3 batteries to get a sufficient charge off. While Nemesis chases us, we have to run around the room and push these massive batteries back into place. After this, the railgun blasts a huge hole in the machinery before it. We have to lure Nemesis in front of the gun so that it can blast him. He's reduced to a small little mutation wriggling on the ground. We have one final choice, to exterminate him for good or to leave him to his fate. It doesn't really matter what we choose. Nemesis either dies by Jill's gun as she delivers her action hero one-line,
You want stars? I'll give you stars.
or Nemesis is destroyed by the incoming missile. Outside, Carlos tells Jill that a second chopper has arrived to bring them to safety. Stepping on the chopper, we realize it's Barry Burton. Another STARS member has arrived to save Jill and take her away to finish Umbrella off once and for all. The missile strikes and Raccoon City is obliterated. Jill's home is gone in an instant, wiped off the face of the earth. Umbrella's consequences and their sins are wiped away for good. The game then ends with a news report about the explosion. Now, if we choose to push Nemesis off of the bridge earlier in the game, then Jill and Carlos get their own helicopter out of this place, because Nemesis kills Nikolai and he doesn't have a chance to steal the vehicle. So Barry only appears if we choose to jump off the bridge, which is why it's my preferred choice in that moment. This ending sort of marks the end of a pretty distinct era for the Resident Evil series. It marks the end of the Raccoon City trilogy. Raccoon City is no more, and the story would have to break the bounds of that location after this. After beating the game, we can unlock one of 8 epilogues that will give us a very brief update on what happened to the characters of the games after the end of this story. These epilogues unlock randomly and require beating the game 8 times to get all of them. So what happened to our favorite STARS members and soldiers once they got out of Raccoon City? Jill went to look for Chris Redfield. She ended up finding an empty hideout of his, but she believes he's still alive out there somewhere. She plans to meet up with him so they can put an end to Umbrella once and for all. Chris is in an unknown location, writing a letter to his sister, Claire, apologizing for not being there once again. He sees a girl walk by that looks like her, and later learns that she's been on the search for him. There is a small memo that we can unlock in Resident Evil 3 that sort of fills the gaps of the STARS members. Jill's diary will tell us what her and Chris were up to in between Resident Evil 1 and the events of 2 and 3. Chris was causing trouble with a lot of the police members and was looking into the G-Virus. He eventually left for Europe, and Barry sent his family to Canada and also followed Chris. The only reason that Jill stayed behind in the first place was to find a research facility that she believed would be important to the case. Barry's epilogue sees him giving his family a tearful goodbye as he leaves to repay his debt to his comrades. Sherry, Leon, and Claire's stories are all sort of intertwined. Judging by Claire's epilogue, it seems that she, Leon, and Sherry Birkin were attacked by the US government at some point. Claire was forced to leave them behind to go look for her brother. Leon is speaking with a member of the US government who wants to make a deal with him, but he's more concerned with Sherry's safety. Sherry is praying that Claire will come back for her, that she won't forget the promise she made as government officials question her. Ada Wong is still alive out there somewhere, but chooses to leave the name Ada Wong behind, to leave that life in the past. Hunk is on a plane with the pilot, who refers to him as Mr. Death, commending him for surviving once again. He thinks to himself, "The death cannot die." These epilogues are pretty poorly translated in some areas, and it can be hard to make out what they're going for exactly, but the general gist is there. Claire is looking for Chris, Jill is looking for Chris is looking for Umbrella, Leon and Sherry are captured, Ada is going through an identity crisis, and Hunk is the Grim Reaper. There is an optional Mercenaries mode that was included in some of the releases of Resident Evil 3. It's called Operation Mad Jackal and sees us taking control of one of the mercs from the Umbrella team. It's pretty similar to the fourth Survivor in that we have to escape the map in a certain amount of time, dealing with a ton of enemies. We can add more time to the clock here by taking out enemies though, which is a nice addition. This is also a big moment for the series because it would mark the first use of the Mercenaries name for this type of minigame, which would become a recurring presence throughout the rest of the series. Resident Evil 3 has a lot going for it. Its story is pretty interesting and manages to expand the world of Resident Evil quite a lot. It makes Umbrella feel like a much larger organization and focuses a lot more on the human element, the individual soldiers working for them, the individual researchers. This was something that Resident Evil 2 did very well, and it's done even better in Resident Evil 3. The game's upgrades to its systems are immense, changes that for the most part feel like they fit this entry of the series. The gunpowder, the faster and stronger undead, new enemy types, and dynamic systems all feel like they play a part in making Resident Evil 3 feel really unique. And the game feels far larger than either of the first two entries. It feels like a genuine city, not quite a living, breathing one, a husk of what once was, but it doesn't feel as contained as the first two games. Rather than experiencing a scenario, it feels like we're pacing out many events back to back. Resident Evil 3 feels like the game that is the most like a contained 90-minute movie, because there's far less time when we're backtracking through levels. It's slightly more linear. Sure, a lot of those cinematic events are just Nemesis chasing us again, but it still works to make Resident Evil 3 actually feel like a movie. Before we talk about Resident Evil 3 as a whole though, we have to talk about its remake, one that would come years down the line as a follow-up to the incredibly successful Resident Evil 2 remake. During development of Resident Evil 2's remake, Capcom began working on a remake of the third Resident Evil game. They wanted to complete the original trilogy of games and bring them onto their new engine for modern audiences. The main goal with this remake was to make it fall more in line with Resident Evil 2's story, to make the two blend together a bit more seamlessly since they take place at the same time. The team also wanted to expand on the characters in the game, specifically Carlos and Jill. Resident Evil 3 Remake was released on April 3rd, 2020 for the Sony PlayStation 4, the Microsoft Xbox One, and Windows systems. Rather than going through Resident Evil 3 Remake beat by beat like I did the original, I'll be giving my general thoughts on it, the differences between the first game, what it did better, and what I feel it did worse. So Resident Evil 3 Remake was made on the same engine as the Resident Evil 2 Remake. This means that it has a similar increase in fidelity. The game looks fantastic, cutscenes and models are done beautifully, the lighting engine really gets to shine in this entry as well. The scenes on the city streets with the neon just beaming down onto the concrete look amazing. Nemesis himself is another highlight, generally looking terrifying and imposing. So obviously a remake separated by 21 years is going to look a lot better, but how does it play? Well, Resident Evil 3 Remake honestly plays basically the same as Resident Evil 2 Remake. Instead of fixed camera angles, we're treated to a third-person view. The gunpowder system is back as well, which fits perfectly in this game since it was already in the original. Obviously, the main differences between this game and Resident Evil 2 are just the things that lie in the design of the original. The original game was far more open and centered around Raccoon City as an environment rather than a central location. But there's a lot of differences when we compare this remake to the original game. In particular, a lot of things have been removed in this remake. First of all, the live selection system is completely gone in this entry. No more choices affecting the outcome of your playthrough. The live selection system in the first game did add a certain amount of replayability. Going through the game blind on your first time would have you wondering how impactful a choice really was. Maybe you would play again just to see exactly how those choices did play out on the other side. Not only that, but the fact that the whole system was very dynamic in general. You could do things in a different order, and things would happen in different places. None of that's really present in Resident Evil 3's remake, and the game is actually surprisingly linear compared to how open Resident Evil 2 remake felt. The alternate ending where Barry picks us up in the helicopter is also entirely removed. I suppose this is because they couldn't be sure that people had played the first game and they assumed they might not know who Barry is. But it's just a nice thing from the original that wasn't here. And I guess, to be fair, the original game kind of felt linear, but I think this is just based on environment design and the fact that we didn't have a central location to branch out from. But the remake actually fits this linear bill pretty well. We still have to move around areas and find key items and use them to solve puzzles, but the whole thing just feels like we're rushing towards the finish line. Not to mention the fact that a lot of areas have been removed from the remake. The clock tower isn't present at all, the park isn't there, the gravedigger fight is entirely removed. I honestly don't really have a problem with the gravedigger fight being removed though, because it did kind of feel out of place in the original game. Outside of that fight, there are no other bosses aside from Nemesis, so it was just kind of odd. The whole city feels a bit downsized in the remake as well. It doesn't seem nearly as large as the original. The original game felt like the central location was the city, and we had to head to different buildings that branched out from there. This structure isn't really present here, just a few medium-sized areas separated by linear areas in between. Nemesis also just doesn't feel as imposing for most of the game in the remake. He feels like he's all over you in the original. He's constantly there, and we're barely given time to breathe, because as soon as we think we're safe, he's running after us again. And Nemesis wasn't overhauled like Mr. X was for the Resident Evil 2 remake. He's just sort of scripted to attack us at certain points in the story, and it doesn't really feel often enough to make us fear him like we did in the original. The removal of all of these elements from the original isn't a big deal by itself. Resident Evil 2 Remake removed some things from the original, and it was still an amazing version of that game. But Resident Evil 3 just removed way too much and managed to lose the core of what made the original game special and unique in the grand scheme of the series. But it isn't all bad. There are still a few things that this game does incredibly well. First of all, I really like the improved story. I think the characters are given much better attention than in the original. The cutscenes allow each of the characters to be more developed, especially the relationship between Carlos and Jill. The two feel like they have a little fling going on, and it just makes for a much better dynamic than in the original. Carlos on his own now feels fleshed out, like he has his own motivations and emotions. He doesn't just feel like this guy that's only there to survive, the guy that's always trying to find the bright side. He now has some depth. Nikolai also feels like he works better as a villain. The other highlight for the remake, in my opinion, are the boss fights. We fight Nemesis multiple times across the course of the game. In the final act, we fight him in a treatment pool as he runs around in a new mutated form, hiding behind pillars that we have to trigger and electrocute him with. The final fight still sees us using a railgun to finish the monster off, but Jill actually wields the thing, which is just insane. The final fight feels like the game just completely goes off the rails in the best way. I know some people had some complaints about this, but I just thought it was one of the coolest parts, and I think in a more general sense, Resident Evil 3 Remake just nails the intense action that I think the original was going for. It honestly feels like in some ways that this action fits better here than it did in the original game. Because the original game had fixed camera angles. It was a follow-up to two through and through survival horror games, and because of the tech at the time, it couldn't really be that full, crazy, balls-to-the-wall action game that it felt like it was trying to be, but the remake allows it to be that. Now, of course, that means that it loses a lot of what made it special in the first place. I honestly probably feel like I would place both games somewhere around the same ranking for me. The ways that the remake improves the original game are just sort of outweighed by the areas that fail to live up to it, and it leaves the remake feeling pretty similar to the original game. Not bad, just different. And it definitely falls below Resident Evil 2's remake for me. There's really no reason to replay Resident Evil 3 Remake. There is this challenge system that allows you to unlock different items and things that you can use on further playthroughs, but nothing is really going to be different, so what's the point in trying to beat the game again? I think part of Resident Evil 3 Remake's letting people down was also just the whiplash that people got from Resident Evil 2 to 3. You could make the case that this whiplash should have been there in the late 90s as well, but the original games were closer in style and tone than their remakes are. It feels like the valley between the remakes is much wider, and bringing people from one story to the next is kind of jarring. In the end, Resident Evil 3 Remake was a fun time for one playthrough, but it certainly wasn't the all-encompassing, completely absorbing remake that Resident Evil 2 had. The game ended up getting mixed reviews critically. It has a 79 out of 100 on Metacritic for the PS4 version of the game. The game still sold alright, managing to ship 4.6 million units by November of 2021, almost 2 years after the release of the Resident Evil 2 remake. But it still saw a 50% decline in sales from that game. Fans were quite mixed on the entry, most pointing out the fact that it removed quite a lot of content from the original game and just didn't capture the same spirit as the original. But before this era in Resident Evil history would end, Capcom would release one final game on the PlayStation 1. Resident Evil Survivor was released on January 27, 2000 in Japan, March 31, 2000 in the EU, and August 30, 2000 in North America, all for the Sony PlayStation 1. Resident Evil Survivor is extremely weird. First of all, this is the first spin-off in the Resident Evil series. Something that Resident Evil would become known for over time would start here. It was also the first-person game in the series, the first light gun shooter in the series, the first in a lot of categories. But damn, this game is just so odd. First of all, I should explain that the game was originally intended to be played with a light gun. In Resident Evil Survivor, Capcom ditches the fixed camera angles for a first-person perspective. To this end, players could buy the Namco GunCon light gun, which would plug into your PlayStation 1 and CRT television set. The gun has a trigger which could be used to shoot, and two buttons on the front that could be used to turn your character. So effectively, we still had tank controls, but from a first-person perspective. This light gun was marketed and released in the PAL region and Japan, but the American version of the game did not come with light gun functionality. You had to use the controller for the game. This was because of the crusade on violent video games at the time. Supposedly, because of the Columbine high school shooting that had happened during development, Capcom was worried about marketing a light gun in American markets, so they removed that functionality from the game. I've seen this piece of trivia in different places online, but I could never actually find a source for it, so if somebody knows where this comes from, I'd be interested to have that information. Regardless, if you want to play this game with a light gun, you need to buy the PAL or Japan version of the game. So that was what I did. I bought the Namco GunCon and the PAL version of the game, stupidly not realizing that PAL games have to be played on PAL CRTs, which I did not have. This meant that I had to play the game with a controller rather than a light gun. Resident Evil Survivor sees you using tank controls to move around different environments. Items are now floating, spinning 3D objects in the environment, and all we need to do to pick them up is to walk over them. This is the same for doors. So the functional control system is pretty simple, probably so that the game can be played with a light gun as well. We still have an inventory system, but we don't have as much management because we don't have a fixed amount of inventory spaces. We can place as many pieces of ammunition in there as we'd like. Other than that, this is a standard Resident Evil game, minus the safe rooms, ink ribbons, item boxes, and inventory management. When we're using a controller, we have to hold down the R1 button to point our weapon, and then aim with the D-pad. It's kind of a clunky way to aim, and it feels odd, but when we shoot an enemy, the view sort of auto-aims or snaps to the target, so that helps a little bit. The whole thing is just really clunky and awkward, and it's really not a big problem for the first 3/4 of the game, but when it starts to lay some actual difficulty on you is when it becomes an issue. The game just gets to the point where it's throwing armies of enemies at you, and there's very little you can do in response. The game is also really short, only totaling in about an hour or so, depending on how good you are at dealing with its mechanics. The game's story is where things start to get really odd, though. The game takes place after the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3. We are on Sheena Island, a place that is full of Umbrella influence. Our main character doesn't remember who he is or how he got here. He survived a plane crash at the beginning of the game and is searching for his memories. We find out pretty shortly that our name is Vincent Goldman, and as we progress through the story, we start to learn more about Vincent. Through memos and cutscenes, we find out that Vincent was the commander of the Umbrella operations on this island. He was a dastardly individual, killing children and basically anyone who stood in his way. He ended up letting out some test subjects by accident and murdering them all for escaping. He wanted to keep this information away from Umbrella because he knew it would mean the end of his career. We basically play through the entire game thinking that we've murdered children, which is just insane. There's even a scene where our character says that none of this matters because it was all in the past.
I may have been a bad person, but that was before. That's not who I am now. I will save these 2 kids. I swear it.
It turns out in the end that we're not actually Vincent, but a man named Ark Thompson. Ark was sent to the island by Leon Kennedy. None of it really makes sense, and the story doesn't really come into play ever again. It just kind of fades into the ether, as the Sheena Island incident is rarely ever brought up after this. The game also reuses a ton of assets from the other games, so it just feels really low effort. I know that the PS1 Resident Evil games have always reused some assets, but there really aren't that many original enemies in this. This game definitely feels like something that should have just been in arcades and on rails rather than sold for consoles. That being said, though, the game is kind of slow for a shooter of its kind. It really feels like it should move faster than it does, but the game just kind of crawls. And that's because it was still trying to be a Resident Evil game with this shooter framework, and it just never really comes together. Really, the only thing that makes this Resident Evil is the name on the cover. Resident Evil Survivor was not well received by critics, currently sitting at a 39 out of 100 on Metacritic. Most reviewers criticized the game for feeling like a cash grab rather than a proper entry in the series. The game seems to have sold somewhere around 500,000 units, so probably less than expected, though the development time on this game couldn't have been much. Resident Evil 3 mostly succeeds at what it set out to do, to bring a unique shift to the Resident Evil series. The first 2 games in the series were mostly the same. They were survival horror games set in a central location, where the goal was to make it through, to escape, to survive. Resident Evil 3's environment and style change set it apart from the games that came before it. It carves out a unique place for itself in the history of this series. But the third game also presents a bit of a shift to the other end of the spectrum. Resident Evil 1 had its roots firmly planted in survival horror. This doesn't mean that action wasn't present in the game, because it was, but the game placed heavy emphasis on atmosphere. The mansion that we inhabit felt almost haunted, but not with spirits, with the undead. Resident Evil 2 changed this a bit and left things feeling a bit more action-y, probably establishing the tone that the series is most known for. Firm and precise survival horror elements with good amounts of action to ramp up the intensity as the game goes on. Resident Evil 3 ends up in the other direction, more action and less survival horror. And that's fine, it works for this entry, it works for the environment that the game sets up, it works for the enemies that the game introduces, it works for the story. Hell, it wouldn't make much sense to have a game that's mostly atmospheric, slow, plotting, and horrifying end with the city being destroyed by a missile. To that end, I can't say that Resident Evil 3 is bad, it's just not my preferred flavor of the series so far. And some of this is due to the fact that Resident Evil 3 wasn't really planned this way. This game wasn't supposed to be Jill Valentine escaping Raccoon City as it's hit with one final bomb to take out the Scourge, threatening to terrorize the world. It was meant to be something else. And my point isn't that whatever it was supposed to be would have been better. It's that changes were made on the fly, and this new unique spin-off was changed and adjusted to become a mainline title. This leaves the game feeling a bit disjointed in some parts. This is a sword that cuts both ways because Resident Evil 3 does genuinely feel like a unique entry. This game is so separate from the first two games, not just in tone and style, but gameplay, mechanics, the live selection system, the movement system, the weapons that we use. It's everything. It both feels unique in that it feels like something fresh and new, but that can sometimes leave the game feeling a bit out of place. In that same regard, Resident Evil 3 feels like the end of an era, the end of this PlayStation 1 trilogy, the end of the Raccoon City arc. The city is gone, entirely destroyed, and that doesn't mean that we won't return to this place in prequels and spin-offs, but for the main tale that Resident Evil is trying to tell, this era is over. And the game ends on kind of a sour note. Sure, Jill escaped, and so did Carlos, and on the other side of things, Leon, Claire, and Sherry all made it out. But the battle was lost. The forces that these people were fighting against were far too strong for mere mortals to deal with. Not just biological weapons and the threat of the overwhelming undead, but also the force of political and bureaucratic influence. Chris was trying to fight Umbrella from the inside, but no one would listen. Maybe it was too many people on the payroll, maybe blackmail was involved, but that battle was lost as well. And now all of these people have far bigger fish to fry. If they want to stop this thing for good, then it will mean taking down Umbrella as a whole, tracking them down to the source. Resident Evil 3 was well received by critics. It currently has a 91 out of 100 on Metacritic. Most reviewers at the time praised the new mechanics that the game introduced and specifically thought Nemesis was a standout enemy. The game sold well yet again, shipping 3.5 million units over the course of its release. It didn't do quite as well as Resident Evil 2 though, and downward trending sales meant that things were going to have to change. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad. Just wanted to give a massive shout out to the people that support me over on Patreon. You people are fantastic. If you want to join this awesome list of names, you can go to the link in the description and support me over on Patreon. Go become a member and you can watch my exclusive videos where I've been going through the Resident Evil movies series, and they're pretty wild. So it's been fun talking about those over there. Go over there and check out the Patreon. Also, let me know in the comments what you thought of the video. Leave a like and a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.